for anyone who wants to catch it later. That's thing one. And thing two is that we're next week, hopefully we'll be able to wrap up the book of Esther, because next week is next Thursday will be Erev Purim, and that's which means that this Sunday we'll have a Purim spiel and things like that at 5 p.m. So that the sort of zoominess of the whole thing will be broken up. So we'll have sort of the Purim fun part this Sunday, and Megillah reading will, God willing, be a week from tonight, next Thursday night, and on the following morning, on Friday morning. The mitzvah is to hear the Megillah read in its entirety, evening and morning. So evening and morning, we'll do it next Thursday and Friday. That's not the chat. And Shailot, questions? The last thing I'm going to throw in, oh, sorry, I should pause actually after asking for questions. The last thing I'll throw in then is what I have hopefully made arrangements for is to have a session on where we at the they have a session on some issues that have popped up recently, which is to say that it's come to my attention there have been a few folks in general, because it happens across the society, and also in the Jewish community, who have had issues with online scams. And I'm sort of like less. It's, for me, it's more understandable when it's individuals who are less fluent in being online, but sort of people who are more fluent in it, it's happened to as well. So I want to have a session on safety scams, and I contacted Jewish Family Service, and Sharon Sear at Jewish Family Service will give a presentation on just this, on being able to being able on how to spot a scam and how to stop once if one clicks on the wrong thing or talks to the wrong person, things like that. And that's going to be in a couple of weeks on March 16th. It's a Tuesday, March 16th at 1 p.m. So I just made the arrangements for it. So we haven't been able to send it an email yet, because this is hours old. But we'll have a session for that with the social work from JFS so that we can make sure that that sort of victimization, which has become more common over the course of the pandemic because we're online more, we can guard against. So that'll be March 16th, Tuesday at 1 p.m. And I'll get in more information about that out as time goes on. So that, and now we will pivot back to Esther. The bracha for Torah study is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher ksharenu v'tzivanu v'tzivanu asok b'divrei Torah. We have made our way to chapter 6. Hopefully today we'll hit 6 and 7. Next week we'll hit 7, 8, 9, or sorry, 8, 9, 10. 10's just a couple of lines, and be finished in time for Purim, which would be itself a minor miracle. Al Hanisi. But we'll dive in on chapter 6. Remember last time this is when last time the evil decree came in, and Mordechai put Esther up to confronting the king. She bravely confronts the king, but when the time comes to make a request, all she says is, "Will the king and Haman come to a banquet that I've set out for them?" And Haman goes, "Tomorrow." And Haman goes home and says that, "Oh, this is awesome! Like finally, I'm like honored by the queen with the king." but all of it's meaningless to me as whenever I see Mordecai not bowing down to me. And his wife and his friends are like, you know what? You should just kill him. Hang him or impale him, depending on your thing. You should just have him killed. Have him get and Haman's like, yeah, I'll have him king. I'll kill him tomorrow morning. That way, when I get to the banquet at noon, I'll be a happy guy. All my problems will be behind me. So that chapter 6. That night, the king could not sleep, or literally the king's sleep wandered. And it's an unusual formulation, and as Alter notes, that will become in modern Hebrew the a term for sleeplessness is just this: his sleep wandered, which is a very poetic sort of way of putting it, and sort of unique, as it were, to the Book of Esther, but is sort of in the light spirit of it. So the king's sleep wandered. So a couple of things. One of the rabbinic traditions is that famously, of course, God's name is not mentioned in the Book of Esther, but there is a rabbinic tradition that whenever it says Ha-Melech, the king, it's not talking about King Achashverosh. It's talking about the king. So those that that this is referring to God, sort of like being disturbed, as it were, by goings on, and then God, of course, will spring into action. That's God's it. But Bashat, the basic sense of the text, of course, isn't that. It's that the king that we've been talking about all along, Ahasuerus, his sleep wandered. Why is his sleep wandering? Well, maybe he just can't sleep. 1. 2, he's excited. The queen just said, I have a big surprise for you tomorrow. So maybe he's just excited on what's going to happen tomorrow. Or he's concerned over the same. Or it's just a plot contrivance, which is what Alter puts out there. Like, this is a plot contrivance. Like, you need something in order to put the story in motion. And this is that thing, that the king can't sleep and he needs to be read to, and that's sort of, and that what he learned in the middle of the night will put the rest of the plot into motion. So that night the king could not sleep, or his sleep wandered, and he ordered to bring in the annals, the Book of Acts, that it may be read to the king. And this again is one of my favorite scenes, because obviously, like the Book of Chronicles, the Devrei Yamim, will be read to the king. And this is how we'll find out that Mordecai will be reminded that Mordecai saved him, and he'll want to honor him, and like suddenly, like all of the plot will be furthered. But also, I just like the fact that the king can't sleep, so he wants to be read a story. Go read me a story, he sort of commands, and then like it's sort of like we'll read the king the history of the kingdom, and that'll put him back to sleep. Like, it's all like this sort of an image of King Ahasuerus as this sort of as this man child is really it's really put forward here. So that night the king could not sleep, and he ordered to be brought the annals of the Book of Acts, that it be read to the king, so they could be read to the king. And he found it written that Mordecai had been told about Bigtha and Teresh, the 2 eunuchs of the king, the guardians of the threshold, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, what honor and grandeur were done for Mordecai on account of this? Right? Like, so again, this the king needs to be read a story, and he's reminded of this thing that, like, that he should have been done with right away, but dealt with right away, but wasn't. It also shows like that earlier, when it says that Esther reported that Mordecai had reported the plot on the king's life, that Esther said it in the name of Mordecai. And again, like, that is why they say that citing your sources brings redemption to the world, right? Because literally here, the thing that begins the redemption of the Jews is the fact that Esther didn't claim that information in her own name. The fact that she said it in Mordecai's name is essential to the redemption of the people. So citing your sources and not acting like stuff like something's your own when it's not, is an idea is your own when it's not, is important. Intellectual property, hugely important, sort of the mitzvah here, right? So and again, then typically the king needs to have somebody tell him how to honor Mordechai. Like literally, he doesn't have a thought in his head. Like it's not that big an intellectual reach to think of like, oh, how do I reward somebody? But like he, at every turn, he needs somebody to tell him what to do. So the and Alter even notes that Achashverosh is a lost note to do. Surely an appropriate means of honoring Mordechai should not have been beyond him. And again turns to counsel for someone to his court. The advice Haman gives him will prove to be Haman's own comeuppance, of course. Like the king said, "What honor and grandeur was done for Mordechai on account of this?" And the king's lads, his attendants, said, "Nothing was done for him." Verse 4, and the king said, "Who is in the court?" And Haman had come to the outer court in the king's house to say to the king to impale Mordecai in the stake that he had readied for him, right? Like, so Haman had gotten up early in order to begin his plot of killing Mordecai. So that's that's again, the Mordecai's reporting that is the MacGuffin, to use the biblical term for it. It's a MacGuffin that like will have to like, that will drive the plot, come up later. Look, Haman is standing in the court, they tell him. Verse 6, and the king said, "Let him come in." And Haman came, and the king said to him, "What should be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said in his heart, "To whom would the king desire to honor more than me?" Of course, this is typical of both the king, who has no idea what's going on or what to do next without somebody telling him what to do. He needs his advisors, to tell him to put out his pants in the morning, it seems. And then there's Haman, who is so self-centered that he can't imagine anyone being the topic of conversation other than himself. This is this might be what got him to the top, and it's going to be what brings him down. To whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Verse 7, and Haman said to the king, "The man who the king desires to honor, let them bring royal raiments, the clothes that the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, and set a royal crown on his head, and give the raiment and the horse into the hands of a man of the king's nobles, the courtiers, and let them dress the man who the king desires to honor, and ride him on a horse through the city square, and call it before him, 'Thus shall be done to the man who the king desires to honor.'" Now, of course, putting on royal clothes that the king has worn, and a royal horse that the king has ridden on, and a crown, and parading that person through the streets would make the average onlooker look and think that that's the king, right? Like Haman is so power hungry that he is sort of like all but claiming the throne for himself, right? Wearing literally royal clothes, riding on the royal horse with a crown on his head, and being paraded through the streets of the capital city. Like that, he's it's all but a coup attempt, as it were, to claim the throne. And ride him through the city square and call it before him, "Thus shall be done to the man who the king desires to honor." Right? Like so in other words, like if he's dressed in all this stuff, and paraded for all this stuff, then clearly people will say, will think of him as the one in charge. Kacha ya'aseh le'ish asher hamelech chafetz b'yikaro. This is what's done. Verse 10, and the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the raiment and the horse, as you have spoken, and do this for Mordechai the Jew, who is sitting in the king's gate. Omit nothing from all you have spoken." So that's the big flip and reversal, appropriate for the theme of the day. Like this is among the reversals that are going to happen. This is sort of like step one. Haman thinks he's proposing honor for himself, but of course he's honoring his worst enemy. And the king says what Haman says back to him, leaving out the crown on his head, right? Like the Haman said, like even the crown, which the king either, as Alter notes, either by accident or on purpose leaves out. That like, all right, that's too far even for me. Even though he says leave nothing out. So he commands Haman to do all of this for Mordecai, which is the big first reversal. Pause.
So the king knows that Mordecai is a Jew because he says Mordecai the Jew.
A Yehudi, right? That seems to be his moniker, yeah.
Okay, so the king is not smart enough to put 2 and 2 together to know that this man who he wants to honor, he's going to kill in a couple of months?
Correct. The yes, he is not. It seems, but that's consistent with his character. Like I feel like that's like it on one level is he doesn't put anything together, right? Everything has to be spoon-fed to him, and that will remain the case, right? Like later on, like when after Haman is killed, the king's sort of like, well, what's done is done, and it's Esther who's like, no, the decree is still out there. Like correct. He doesn't know. He doesn't put it together. He doesn't.
Rabbi?
Yep.
In the Jewish Study Bible, there's 2 things that stand out to me about this story, and it says a comic misunderstanding is the funniest thing in the book. So I never thought the Bible was ever described as being funny, and then it says again that it's a comic misunderstanding.
Yes, 100%. There is no doubt, as I've said, like there's no doubt that I think this is, no doubt in my mind, this is meant as a comic story. If those of the impression that the Bible is not supposed to be funny is a failure on my part or our part as rabbi or rabbis in giving an impression, there is no question that those who say the Bible is not supposed to be funny are wildly misreading the text. Not only this text in Esther. Esther, again, obviously is supposed to have jokes in it. We've pointed a few of them out along the way. I think even what Rana's question, sort of like that he doesn't put 2 and 2 together. I think that's a joke. That 2 chapters ago he gave the go ahead to kill the Jews, and now is like, you know what? Make sure you honor Mordecai the Jew. Like, and also like I'm so clueless that I can't I can't think of how to do it myself. Like, and the reversal that Haman saying, would the king wish that more than me? Like, 100% totally supposed to be jokes, and prominently in the Torah, Parshat Balak. Parshat Balak is 100% supposed to be a comic sequence. There is no other plausible explanation for Parshat Balak other than comic sequence. And certainly there is no plausible read of the Book of Esther other than as comedy. Yes, definitely the JSB is 100% right.
Also, Rabbi, it says in here, I'm going back to chapter 3, I think it is. He didn't say there are Jews. He said there's a people. The rules are different. He never actually says they're Jews. And then he gave his ring to Haman to write up this degree and seal. So it doesn't look like he even know who he was condemning.
Right. There's a certain people scattered and separate from referring to the line you said, scattered and separate from the peoples and all the provinces of your kingdom, and their rules are different from every people's, and they do not observe the king's rules, and does not pay for the king to leave them in peace. If it please the king, let be written to wipe them out. And 10,000 talents of silver will I measure out to the court overseers to bring to the king's treasure. The king removed his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the son, and said, "The silver is yours and the people's to do with what is good in your eyes."
He never mentions that there were
Right.
Jews.
He doesn't say it, which is excellent point. Good catch, Bob. Like that's an excellent point. The one.
And the king is clueless enough where he just let him go and do this.
Right. The king gives his ring and says, "Do what you want." And that's good demagoguery, is of course to be just vague enough to be able to do what you want, send the message that you want to send, and not be as brazen as could possibly be. This is always a good move by demagogues and bigots, which is to the most effective of them use slightly vague language, like step just an inch short of saying something that could get you into trouble. Because
plausible deniability.
A little bit of plausible deniability. Say it so that everyone knows what you're talking about, except you can deny. I never said that. If you got the impression that I meant for you to do that, I never said it. Like
Rabbi,
that's.
I'm gonna look at my watch in a minute.
You can look at but notice that it's sort of Bob's story is that Haman does it, and it's a super smart move because he gets what he wants. He can kill the Jews, but he knows, maybe the king's like boyhood chum was Jewish, and he would have said no. Because again, later on in that same chapter, what we were quoting from is chapter 3, and then in verse 12 of chapter 3. The back half of verse 12 of chapter 3. In the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and it was sealed with the king's ring. And the missives were sent out by the hands of the couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, kill, and wipe out all the Jews, from young lad to old man, babes and women, on a single day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, to take their spoils. A copy of the writing was given as rule in every single province, manifested to all the people to be ready for this day. And then the king and Haman sit down to drink, right? So it goes out over the king's name to kill the Jews. But of course, the king is clueless enough not to be paying attention to the fact that it went out, because he's not exactly, he's not reading his briefings, as it were. So yes, it happens. The king, again, not a bad guy, just a clueless guy. He's not meaning he's not malevolent. The king is.
He doesn't read. He doesn't read the PDBs.
He's not. He doesn't set out to be a bad person. The effect of having him as king is, well, to this point in the story, bad. But the king himself isn't malevolent. Haman is clearly malevolent, but the king isn't. But fascinating. Yeah. So great bit. Yeah, he says Mordechai the Jew, but doesn't know that there's an order to commit genocide against the Jews in his kingdom. So you'd think he might have even just picked up on talk about it. No. And again, maybe that's part of the comedy of the story, that the king is so wildly clueless that's part of the joke. Admit nothing while you've chosen. 11. And Haman took the raiment and the horse and dressed Mordecai and rode him on the horse through the city square and called out before him, "Thus shall be done to the man who the king desires to honor." Right. So that line that he said, he then has to say. Sure. I want to shout out with the Hebrew. So that it's a great bit. To our mouth the
Yeah. Rabbi's class.
So what Haman wanted to do for himself, he has to do for Mordechai. And if Haman was angry at Mordechai not bowing, imagine Mordechai in the king's clothes on the king's horse, with Mordechai walking through the streets, having to shout to everybody how wonderful Mordechai is and how much the king loves Mordechai. Like that. So if one was driving him nuts, this is over the top. 12, and Mordechai returned to the king's gate, and Haman was thrust back into his house. And of course, because Mordechai was wearing sackcloth and ashes, changes into the royal garb, then changes back into sackcloth and ashes. Great, also like a comic switch. Mordechai returned to the king's gates, and Haman was thrust back into his house, mournful and distraught, right? Like he's all wrought up over this. And Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends that what had befallen him, right? In case I hadn't heard. He's like, ugh, you'll never guess what happened to me today. Yes, last night I came home and he told me to kill Mordechai. This morning I wake up planning on killing Mordechai. I end up walking him through the streets on the king's horse, shouting out how wonderful he is. And his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, if, this is also prone to questioning, if Mordechai, Zeresh Ishto, Ovav, at Kol Asher Karchuvi, Omer, Lo, Chochmato, Zeresh Ishto, Im Mizra Yudi Mordechai. If Mordechai is of the seed of the Jews, before whom you have begun to fall, you shall not prevail over him, but you shall surely fall before him. While they were still speaking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
In the Jewish Study Bible, it has a midrash, which is fascinating.
Yep.
It's some midrashim embellish the scene where Haman has to put Mordecai on the horse. And it says, adding to Haman's subservience and dishonor by imagining the preparations to include Haman's washing of Mordecai, since he was still covered in the ashes of mourning, and even having to wash the bathhouse, dressing him and lowering himself that Mordecai could step upon his neck in order to mount the horse.
Awesome. That's a great midrash. And again, like sort of it's pressing both the rabbis' interest in making the Jews seem greater and greater, and Haman seem lower and lower. Right. And obviously, like if you can't, and also like put together like a clear thing, it obviously would be unacceptable to appear in royal garb, in mourning, or in a dirty way, right? Like, so clearly Mordechai does have to be cleaned up. And Haman is the person in charge of making sure the cleaning happens. Yeah, and then stepping on his back to get on the horse is just another good bit. Another great midrash that I would like to share with you here. The Torah community. Wait, I'm going to throw in this one because it's awesome. When Haman passed with Mordecai through the courtyard of his house, Haman's daughter, standing on the roof, caught sight of them. Assuming the rider, so she's standing on the roof looking down, so she doesn't, it's a little bit of a distance. Assuming the rider to be her father, right? Because like Haman, who would the king wish to honor more than Haman? And the leader of the horse, the groom, to be Mordecai, because who would be in the humiliating position more than Mordecai, who would knowing that if Haman's being honored, it must be Mordecai who is in the position of having to shout his praises. The Haman's daughter quick took the family chamber pot and from the roof dumped it on the head of the person who she assumed to be Mordecai, leading the horse, but of course was in fact Haman, her father. So she put the dumped the family chamber pot from the roof onto her father heads, and then when she looked and saw, when Haman looks up to see what had happened, she sees that it's her father, and having so dishonored her father, here it gets grim and less comic, if you actually care about human life. She sees that she had dumped the chamber pot onto her father's head, sees that it's Mordechai being honored, is humiliated in the extreme, and jumps off the roof to her death. So that's why when it says next that Haman comes home mourning with covered head, mourning over his daughter, and not over what had happened, but over his daughter, and with covered head because he was covered. So that's another midrash that brings out sort of the like taking the story and turning it up to 11. Yeah, go ahead.
Have
I
we,
had a quick question
have we,
on just going back to the Jewish Study Bible, in note, they said that the same night that Haman erected the stake, Mordecai, and it says, and it cites the Book of Records, CF 2.23. What's the Book of Records?
That's the history. It's the history that they write. So it says that when Esther told about Mordecai revealing the assassination plot on the king, it was written down in the Book of Records, and then when the king wakes up in the middle of the night, they start reading to him from the Book of Records, right? Like, so that's just where they recorded like the history of what was going on day to day.
It sounds like it's the Book of Records still exists, that they could cite it.
In the story, yes. So meaning that the event, this is, maybe 5 years difference between when chapter 6 happened and when chapter 2 happens. Like there's like a 5-year difference. So yeah, so it's then. This not in the time there. It is relatively frequent through the course of the Tanakh for them to refer to the royal histories that were written. Those things don't survive, obviously, down to our day, or much past the time of the time when they were happening. But like there's no pretending that this is the only book ever written. Like the other people are writing books that are focused on like the day-to-day activities of the kingdom.
the midrash you cited, you talked about Haman's daughter, but
Yeah.
all we hear about are Haman's sons who die on the gallows. We never hear about any daughter.
Correct. But that's because the daughter doesn't survive to chapter 9 for her to be hung on the gallows, right? Like hanged on the gallows, because she jumps off the roof here. So yes, he had children. We don't they don't we also don't hear about the family chamber pot, right? But it makes it into the midrash. Let's see, let's find it. Yeah, it's from Talmud. Megillah has the story of Haman's daughter dumping the family chamber pot on his head. Which, by the way, if you knew that midrash, I'm sure like you were probably counting down. Like there's no way he's letting that one slide. What's actually strange about this scene is that they're like, is that after yesterday being like, oh yeah, you should definitely kill Mordecai. today Zeresh and the advisors are like, oh, well, if Mordechai's Jewish, you're not gonna take him out, which is weird, right? Like the one is the if he's Jewish, like one, of course, like we know him to be Jewish. The king just said Mordechai Yehudi. Everyone seems to know he's Jewish. That seems to be a thing. Or it's just like a matter of speaking, like sort of like if in the sense of since he's Jewish, you'll never beat him. Why this isn't like made clear in the text. Maybe they're this is like sort of like anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking, right? Like, oh, if the Jews are too powerful. Here it's thought of as a good thing, but there's a bad thing, and they say so that you've begun to fall and you will continue to fall before him, and like in the moment that's going to be what happens. He's going to literally fall, not before Haman, but before Esther, not before Mordechai, but before Esther. Others, all right, chapter 7. We're getting through this. And the king and Haman came to drink with Esther. Here again, notice everything is centered around drinking. Right? The Queen Esther properly. So again, lots of drinking. The king might not know who he's ordered genocide to be committed against, might not know how to honor somebody, might need stories read to him when he's sleepless, but the guy knows to show up for a drinking party. The king Haman came to drink with Queen Esther, and the king said to Esther again on the second day of the wine banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther?" The mishtei hayayin, right? It's again specifically a wine feast. מה שאלתך אסתר המלכה, ותיתן לך מה בקשתך עד חצי המלכות ותעש. What is your petition, Queen Esther, and it will be granted you. Up to half the kingdom, and it will be done. And Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me in my petition, and my people's in my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be wiped out. And had we been sold to be male slaves and slave girls, I would have remained silent. For the foe is not worth bothering the king. Talk about Jewish guilt. This is like Exhibit A, right? Like sort of like, if I and my people had just been sold into slavery, I wouldn't have bothered you. Not worth your time. You're a busy guy. But as long as I have you here, could you spare my life and the life of my people? I just wonder maybe you'd be able to do it. Right? Great act by Queen Esther here. Like again, why doesn't she just act right away? She is building the thing. So first there's the request in the throne room. Then there's wine feast A. And then there's wine feast B. And he seems, and the idea seems to be to get him in a good mood. He's in a totally good mood. He's not like, you're not barging on the throne and springing something on him. He's got a couple of parties, more than a couple of drinks. And all I'm asking for is my life. And King Ahasuerus said, and he said to Queen Esther, sort of like a bit of a odd formulation there, either on purpose by accident, sort of in the fairy tale maybe way of speaking here. And King Ahasuerus said, and he said to Queen Esther, who is it and where is he? Whose heart has prompted him to do this? Right? Again, like sort of like there's this great way of saying, Vayomer Melech Ahasuerus, Vayomer Lester Amalka, Miuze, Vezahu. Which is in Hebrew again sounds funny, like, who is it and where is he? Whose heart prompted him to do this? And Esther said, a man, foe, and enemy. This evil Haman. Like, and she, like, again, like, waits till like the end to like spring who it is on it. Who, again, like, presumably, like, during this conversation, like, the king or Haman is sort of like probably like begun to like sort of like shrink back in his seat. Like you can sort of imagine him sort of being like, oh my gosh, like what's gonna happen next? And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Right. So she waits to spring the trap and then springs it. She's flipped the king's mood from super happy and drunk to super angry and drunk. Which probably obviously is part of the plan. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine banquet to the pavilion garden. And Haman stood to plead for his life to Queen Esther, for he saw that the evil was fixed against him by the king. So the king is so angry. He doesn't know what to do with himself. And he sort of like gets up and starts pacing and like starts walking outside into the courtyard and starts pacing outside is the image that he's so sort of like doesn't know what to do, which knowing King Ahasuerus is totally in character. Like the one believable thing about all this is that the King Ahasuerus didn't know what to do with himself. That's totally in character. And he starts pacing around outside and Haman stands up and starts like begging to Queen Esther, like, oh, I didn't know, like sort of like he sort of starts pleading with his life. And the king came, ate and the king came back from the pavilion garden, the house of the wine banquet, and Haman was fallen on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, is it also to force the queen with me in the house? That's the next comic sequence that sometimes gets lost. They would have been sitting on couches, these like triclinia, and they were not sitting at a table. They would be in like sort of reclining on couches. Picture old-timey satyrs, like this sort of thing. Like, and first Haman stood to beg for his life, and then he drops to his knees to beg. So she's still sitting on the couch. Haman's on his knees in front of her. The king walks back in from the courtyard and thinks that Haman is trying to rape Esther. It's okay not to imagine rape as being funny, but you gotta swing to the sort of wild world of the story. It's supposed to be a comic scene where the king walks in and in his drunken anger thinks that Haman and Esther are now having sex on the couch together. Is also to force the queen with me in the house. So like the king, who was angry before, now walks in, and this is part of like the sexual comedy of the whole thing. Is after everything, is this extra level of like unexpected sex. And that's is it also to force the queen with me in the house? Like, wait a minute, like, and like with me in the house is like the added comic line, like, if you're gonna try and sleep with the queen, like, wouldn't you wait till I was out of town? Like how, like what? I'm right here. I'm right here. I was right outside. Like, didn't you know that I was gonna walk back in? Like, so that's part of that again, I think is part of the joke. And that's Alter's note. The sexual comedy of the Book of Esther becomes particularly acute at this moment. Ahasuerus, seeing Haman sprawled out on Esther's couch, briefly imagines that his first minister is attempting to rape the queen in the king's very presence. This misapprehension may be sharpened by his own uneasy awareness that he has failed to invite the beautiful queen to his bedchamber for a month. Right. So there's that, right? That obviously that she had said, I haven't been invited to see him for 30 days, 2 days ago. So so he knows that his young, beautiful queen has been alone. So that and of course, Alter also notes, as many of you may remember, sleeping with the king's wife is a way of claiming the throne. So Haman, who in the last chapter all but tried to claim the throne by wearing the royal robe and the royal crown and riding on the royal horse, now is imagined as trying to sleep with the queen. If you remember, Absalom sleeps with one of King David's concubines on the roof of the palace as part of his coup attempt, right? Like that, sleeping with one of the king's concubines on the roof of the palace, i.e. in full view of everyone, is a way of saying, you know who the king is? The one who sleeps with the queen. That's who. How do you know who the king is? It's the one who's sleeping with the queen. So that's what Absalom does, and that's also what Ruvain does. Ruvain, son of Jacob, sleeps with one of Jacob's concubines towards the end of the book of Genesis, as a way of claiming leadership in the family. That by sleeping with one of Dad's concubines, that shows that I am now the leader of the family, now that he's old and off the scene. So it doesn't work for Ruvain, doesn't work for Absalom, and doesn't work for Haman, but everyone in that time would have known that that's a power move that has less to do with sex and more to do with power, as is sometimes the case with rape. So no consent, but here it's played. In those instances, it's a serious matter. Here, because the Book of Esther is played for comedy. The word had scarcely issued from the king's mouth, and Haman's face turned pale. So Haman, who at first was scared for his life, now sees that his being on his knees and begging for his life has been misinterpreted as something else, and he is even more terrified. And Harvona, one of the eunuchs, said before the king, "Look, there's actually a steak that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king, standing in Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Impale him on it." And they impaled Haman on the stake they had readied for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided. That escalated quickly and de-escalated quickly.
That's the only act that Ahasuerus has done on his own,
Yes,
aside from ordering banquets.
but correct, but almost not even that, because the
He didn't do it on his own. The eunuch told him to hang the guy.
right. That's part of the joke. That literally the helper is the one who prompts him again, right? Meaning that, like, again, he doesn't actually think for himself. So he doesn't say hang him on it, but he leads the horse to water.
He leads him.
Right. He makes it inescapable. Oh, and by the way, there's a stake or a gallows, again, like whatever you want to translate, that Haman built for Mordecai. And again, defines who Mordecai is. Mordecai, who did the king good, because we assume that the king forgot from yesterday who Mordecai is, right? Like who did good for the king. There's a stake for him, and then Haman, he plans the idea in his head. So still, the king doesn't actually think. He has even the lowly eunuch gets the saves it. And Harvona is one of my favorite characters, both because the brachas in Love Shalom probably are 431, maybe. Because the blessing after the reading of the Megillah on Purim night is no, it's not here. Grab. Hold on. I don't know if I find the proper bracha on 903. The bracha after reading the Megillah is it is Baruch Atah, who pleads our cause, judges our claim, avenges our wrong, brings retribution to our enemies, and punishes our foes. Baruch Atah, blessed are you, who on behalf of his people Israel exacts punishment from all foes, the God who brings salvation. And then there's a little poem that's read, Asher Eni, that ends with Shoshanat Yaakov. Shonat Yaakov, the lily of Jacob, rejoiced and was glad. When together they saw Mordecai robed in royal blue. You have been their eternal salvation, their hope in every generation, to make known that all who hope in you will not be put to shame. All who trust in you shall never be humiliated. Cursed be Haman, who sought to destroy me. Blessed be Mordecai, the Yehudi. Cursed be Zeresh, wife of him who terrified me. Blessed be Esther, whose actions saved me. Cursed be all the wicked. Blessed be all Israel. And may Charvona too be remembered for good. V'gam Charvona zachor latov. The blessing after the reading of the Megillah ends with, and Charvona is remembered for good, which I love because Charvona has this one walk-on scene where he's like, the gallows is right over there. And that there's this, and that the tradition has a sense of, you know who really saved the day? Charvona, because Charvona had the presence of mind to be like, king, there's a gallows over there. And then he makes it into the bracha for that. And there's a Purim drinking song that is that just basically repeats that line. Charvona zachor latov.
Also, one of the only books I remember where they actually named servants.
Yes. Well, here, notice again, it's because here in the case of Charvona, it's honor. Like Bigtan and Teresh are named for bad reasons, the ones who want to do it, but they here it seems to be on purpose. Give them credit where it's due. And it ends very quickly. Yeah, so the king makes his decision on his own, but barely on his own. And
Bless you.
thank you.
Gesundheit.
So, should we continue? We should break there. The break there. Next week will be, it's actually Ta'anit Esther. When we meet, we're going to do chapters 8 and 9. 8 is relatively short. 9 is the longest chapter. 10 is the shortest. But it's Erev Purim. So no matter what, we're getting through all of them on time. But this, again, to like Ed's point earlier, like the important thing is to remember it's supposed to be comedy. There's no question about it. And the sort of and some of it is supposed to be body comedy, as we've sort of pointed out along the way. All right, for those who wish, we'll do tonight we'll do it. We'll tonight. For those who wish to join Talmud class, Shabbat tomorrow night, 7:00, 9:30 Shabbat morning for davening, 8:45 for Pirkei Avot for those who wish to join, and take care of yourselves. Again, if you need help. Making arrangements for a vaccine, I can't promise help, but I know people who have been effective in getting people help. So stay safe.
All right, stay safe, stay warm.